Hey everyone, let's take a little bit closer look at the blood vessels that carry the blood to and from the heart and to all parts of the body. The delivery system for dropping off the nutrients and oxygen that all of our cells need and picking up the wastes that those cells produce so that the wastes can be delivered to the excretory organs that can get rid of the waste. So we've already seen the first couple of slides, but I wanted to put them up again and ask you to just review the structure of the blood vessels on this slide and the functions on the next slide. Pause the video, read over that, and make sure you have a good basic understanding of what's the difference between an artery and a vein and a capillary, and what are some of the key parts of arteries, veins, and capillary. Notice that the structure is similar in both. The electron micrograph at the top up here shows the distinct differences in their structure relating to the function, namely that the walls of arteries tend to be thicker, the lumen or the interior tends to be narrower compared to veins. And that has to do with the arteries having to carry blood under high pressure. Veins do not. And the veins having this larger lumen, the larger opening, that means a larger volume. And so our veins can sort of serve as a reservoir of extra blood in our circulatory system. So pause here and read over this if you need to. Go back and look at the previous slide if you need to. Okay, so we've measured blood pressure a little bit, and our blood pressure varies depending on the situation, and we can increase the blood pressure when we need to. Blood pressure is determined by two important factors: the cardiac output, how much blood the heart is pushing out into the arteries, and hopefully that seems sensible. If you push more blood into the arteries, that blood will be exerting a greater pressure on the walls of the arteries. Arteries have very elastic walls, so they can stretch and accommodate that increased blood pressure. The second factor is peripheral resistance. Blood pressure will go up when the blood flowing through the vessels encounters greater resistance. There are a couple of ways that this can happen. First, we have the ability to regulate the peripheral resistance by vasoconstriction. We have muscles in the walls of our arteries, and there are rings of muscles around most of the small arteries that lead to capillary beds. And if we want to restrict the blood flow to a certain part of our body, to a certain capillary bed, we can contract those muscles in the walls of the arteries, pinching them off. And then we can also lower blood pressure by vasodilation, relaxing all of the muscle in the walls of the arteries. That allows the artery to expand and accommodate more blood and the flow of blood more smoothly. Peripheral resistance will drop and the blood pressure will drop. So if our heart rate goes up when we exercise, blood pressure tends to go up because cardiac output increases. If you know someone who is a smoker or a tobacco user of any kind, nicotine, the addictive drug that is in tobacco, is also a toxin. It's a poison that causes vasoconstriction, and that's the reason that people who smoke often have health problems relating to cardiovascular disease, because the nicotine in the tobacco causes vasoconstriction, raises their blood pressure, and so they have this chronic high blood pressure that can lead to damage in our arteries. Now, the key role of this vasoconstriction and dilation is to keep blood flowing where it's needed. We can pretty finely tune where blood is going in our body. And so, for example, I'm sitting on my keister right now making this video. So the big muscles in my leg, in my rear end, are not doing any work. And so they need very little blood flow to keep them happy right now. So my body will be restricting the blood flow to those big muscles by vasoconstricting the arteries leading to those muscles, and instead having that blood divert to organs like my kidneys, where that blood can enter and be filtered of wastes and toxins. So while we're not using muscles, we restrict the blood flow to those muscles and can send the blood to our digestive system, to our kidneys, to organs that are involved in maintenance, but are not critical moment to moment for our survival. Here's a picture showing the one-way valves in a vein, and you could imagine that this is perhaps the veins running up our lower leg. And so we have muscles in the lower leg that can contract, and when they do that, muscles get shorter and rounder, and that would pinch in on the vein that's in that part of our leg. Because of the location of these one-way valves, when you squeeze on this area of the vein, the blood will move up through the open valve, and it will be unable to backflow because of the one-way valve behind it. And this is how we keep the blood flowing in our legs up towards our heart, despite the fact that the pressure in those veins is quite low. And an interesting sort of aside here, when soldiers are trained, they are often trained that when standing at attention, especially for extended periods of time, they should cyclically squeeze and relax the muscles in their legs and their calves, and their thighs and their calves, to keep the blood returning to their brain. Because if you stand upright long enough and relax, and if your blood pressure isn't high enough, you can just faint because of lack of blood return to your heart. All right, last thing to talk about are capillaries and the exchange that takes place at capillaries. All of the other vessels in our circulatory system, the arteries and the veins, are for carrying blood from one place to another, and they are not involved in the critical function of our circulatory system, exchanging nutrients and waste with all the cells in the body. The walls of arteries and the walls of veins are too thick for any exchange of nutrients and waste to take place. Not so of our capillaries. Capillaries are tiny, microscopic vessels. Most of the 100,000 kilometers worth of blood vessels in our body are made up of capillaries. And those capillaries are where all the exchange takes place between blood and between the cells in all the different tissues and organs in our body. So, blood flowing into the capillary beds can be controlled. We mentioned this a minute ago. There are tiny sphincter muscles, circular rings of muscle in the arterioles leading into the capillary beds. So we can flood a capillary bed with blood when that tissue needs a good supply of blood. And for example, in my resting leg muscles right now, it might look a little bit more like this bottom part of the diagram. The sphincter muscles are contracted, and only a trickle of blood may be going through that capillary bed. But in a resting muscle, they only need a trickle of blood. So that exchange is taking place at this level in these capillary beds. And every cell in the body must be no further than about 1 cell layer away from a capillary. If every cell isn't very close to a capillary, it will never be able to get the nutrients that it needs because the other cells in the path between that cell and the capillary will be absorbing all those nutrients. And that cell that's not super close to the capillary will also drown in its own waste because those waste will not be carried away efficiently by those capillaries. So all of this can happen because capillaries have super, super thin walls. Every capillary is made of a layer of endothelial tissue, and those cells making up the walls of that tissue are flattened out, super thin. And so the vessels are very narrow, just wide enough for red blood cells to flow through single file. And the walls are super, super thin so that the distance that nutrients and waste have to travel to get in or out is very short. If you have a shorter distance, you can more efficiently exchange substances across that wall. So as the blood enters the capillary, and in this picture that is from left to right, the arterial end of the capillary where the blood is being pushed in under higher pressure coming from that artery. The pressure is high enough so that the tiny gaps between the cells making up the wall of the capillary will allow a little bit of the fluid of the blood to leak out. As a little bit of fluid leaks out, the pressure inside the capillary becomes less and less. Eventually, that pressure in the capillary can become lower than the pressure in the surrounding fluid, and towards the vein end of the capillary bed, the pressure inside the capillary is lower than the tissue or interstitial fluid, and you get fluid moving back in. This is exactly what we want to happen. So we get bulk movement of the nutrient-rich fluid in our blood spilling out as the blood enters the capillary. And as the blood is about to leave the capillary, go back into a vein to return to the heart, some of that liquid comes back in to the vessel, into the capillary. Now that fluid will contain wastes like carbon dioxide and other byproducts of metabolism that these cells up here have been producing. And it's now carried off in that venous end of the capillary to be returned to the circulation, returned through the veins to the heart so that it can be carried to the proper organs for excretion. Apart from this bulk movement of some of the liquid part of the blood, so the cells never leave, even large molecules like proteins cannot leave the vessel. Only tiny molecules, simple molecules, can spill out. But larger molecules can be moved from a capillary to the tissue, the interstitial fluid, by active transport and by other mechanisms. So all the good stuff that needs to be released at the level of the tissues in a capillary bed gets put out into that fluid. And the waste moved by diffusion and sometimes by active transport into the capillary so that they can be carried away.